Hi there guys, I hope you are having a good day. Now Andy Ruiz Jr. is still losing weight, and on his YouTube channel he said he's down 20 pounds and he's doing it for AJ and the road back to the belts. So Andy Ruiz Jr. is currently in training and he's training over Christmas time to get ready for next year. I sense a big 2021 for Andy Ruiz Jr., but it's about discipline, it's also about his boxing as well. So can he get back in the ring in early 2021 and get back to winning ways? Because he has been out of the ring for a full year now, so it is important that he gets active once again, but at the moment he is cutting his weight down to get ready for his comeback. Now, one interesting thing that Andy Ruiz Jr. said in that video is that he's never lifted weights before. This is his first time. Maybe he's done it like a little bit before, but never like this, never like in a training camp where he has specifically gone and done weights with a program, with a personal trainer. So that will be different for Andy Ruiz Jr. and will call new muscle fibers into action for him. Obviously there are going to be certain things that change. He is going to have better muscle response by doing weights. Not hugely, because obviously he's training anyway, but lifting weights does call in new muscle fibers, meaning that Andy Ruiz Jr. will be faster and stronger. Not hugely, it will be marginal, but it will help him. Now, during that training footage, which I will link in the description below, I noticed that Andy Ruiz Jr. was doing a lot of time under tension and negatives on the way down. So you perform the repetition, and then on the way back down, you do it slowly, say 3 to 5 seconds. Now what this does is calls in new muscle fibers and increases time under tension, meaning that the weight is controlled on the way down, which increases time under tension, meaning more muscle fibers are used. The majority of muscle fiber damage or microtrauma occurs during the eccentric phase, and this damage causes the muscles to adapt and call in new muscle fibers, which will build bigger muscles and make you stronger. That seems to be what Andy Ruiz Jr. is focusing on, the negative and the time under tension, which is very important, say for someone like Andy Ruiz Jr., an athlete, because he's not necessarily trying to get ripped. I mean, he says he wants a six-pack, but I think that it is more important for him to focus on his training that benefits him for boxing, as opposed to just looking good, because look at the shape he was in when he fought Anthony Joshua the first time around. So that isn't going to bother him too much, or it shouldn't. I hope it doesn't anyway, because he does want to be focusing on ways to improve his boxing as well, not just the way he looks, and not just thinking about getting that weight down. And the fact that he is doing negatives and time under tension and potentially progressive overload, which is like you do say 8 reps of a certain weight, then the next week you go and do 9 or 10 of that same exercise with the same weight. So progressively you're getting stronger as you go along. So you're not staying in the same place, and you rarely plateau by doing that. So that will make sure that he's progressive during his workouts and throughout the weeks building up to his next fight. Now, doing negatives can be taxing on the CNS, which is your central nervous system, and to your muscles, so volume does need to be monitored to avoid injury. So that is something that would be very important as well, considering he's not just doing weights, he's also training in boxing as well. So this is a part of his workout, it's not the whole workout, and obviously having a personal trainer there monitoring him will help him with that. He shouldn't get injured by doing this. This will make him better. If he's never done it before as well, he's adding things to his training camp to make him better, which is important for Andy Ruiz Jr. because maybe in the past Andy Ruiz Jr. hasn't been the most focused of fighters, and that has been his downfall a couple of times in certain training camps and in certain fights. So there are ways in which that Andy Ruiz Jr. can improve, and that is encouraging considering the results he got when maybe he wasn't even really that focused on the goal at hand. So this is important for Andy Ruiz Jr. and it is interesting to see what he will do in 2021. Now, he did say about Anthony Joshua, he said he's doing it all for him. Well, not all of it, but he did say Anthony Joshua's name. That is interesting because what about Tyson Fury? There is 2 champions in the heavyweight division, Fury and Anthony Joshua. He's talking about AJ again because obviously they have that history and it would be a trilogy fight if he got AJ back in the ring. I would like to see him in there with Tyson Fury, just to see how he fares. We have seen him in there with Anthony Joshua, it would be interesting to see him in there with Tyson Fury, so that could be a very interesting fight. Obviously he has been touted to come back against Chris Arreola, which I guess is a good warm-up fight for him considering he has been very inactive. I mean, Anthony Joshua just fought Kubrat Pulev, he was out of the ring for a year, and obviously Andy Ruiz Jr. hasn't fought since Anthony Joshua, so he does need to get his feet wet, get back in the ring, and all of this training that he is doing, he needs to put that into motion in the ring, and maybe jumping in there with someone like a Tyson Fury straight away isn't going to be beneficial for Andy Ruiz Jr. He needs to build his way back to that point. So I would say Chris Arreola, maybe a Luis Ortiz, or someone like that, then he's ready to go back to a Tyson Fury. Because you would think that him losing weight and being in a different condition, that would benefit him greatly, which it will, but there are certain things that he will have to adjust with his boxing as his new physique starts to come in, because there are certain things such as his distance, his timing, and his balance that will be affected by his weight loss. Because, I mean, being lighter, he's not going to be as powerful. Being lighter, he's not going to be as capable as he was at taking a punch. He's not going to be. When you're 20 stone, you're going to be taking a punch better than when you're 16, 17 stone. It's just logic. Not hugely, because I think that the punch resistance will be there. He was lighter against Parker, and it was there. So I think that it won't be diminished hugely, but there will be some things that are taken away from that aspect of Andy Ruiz Jr. But he does gain the ability to move better on his feet. That's not going to be a massive thing, because I think that Andy Ruiz Jr. has slow feet. He's got fast hands, but he's got slow feet. That's the way it is. I think that you can improve those things somewhat, but I think that there are limits. I think that if you have fast feet, then you have fast feet. You can also make it faster, but I think that that is just the way it is. Andy Ruiz Jr. has slow feet but fast hands. He can increase his footwork and his foot speed, but not hugely. There is a limit to what Andy Ruiz Jr. can do. And obviously no one is perfect, so he has the speed, he has the punch resistance, he punches quite hard as well, so he has those things. He just needs to find a way to work around his slow feet with things like positioning, which is what Eddie Reynoso, his boxing coach, will teach him, because that is very important. You don't necessarily have to have fast feet, but good positioning. Canelo, he doesn't have really fast feet, but he has good positioning and good timing. That does benefit him and help him overcome those shortcomings, and Andy Ruiz Jr. can take a lot from that, especially working with the same coach, Eddie Reynoso. So I think that things are working well for Andy Ruiz Jr. He's doing the right things. He doesn't need to lose too much weight, because I think that being heavier does benefit him, with certain things like his punching power, which maybe naturally he's not hugely gifted at, like his speed. Then there is also his punch resistance. He could take anything from even Anthony Joshua, who is one of the biggest punchers in the heavyweight division. I mean, too many punches would stop him, but I think that he was taking punches well in there with AJ, and we know how hard Anthony Joshua punches. So that will be very important for Andy Ruiz Jr. Finding the balance, not too heavy, not too light. That is the important thing. And over the course of his next few fights, maybe Chris Arreola, maybe Luis Ortiz, those kind of fights, he can gauge where his weight should be. Anthony Joshua has been doing that since the Andy Ruiz Jr. loss. He came in around 16 stone 13 pounds in the rematch, and he was 3 or 4 pounds heavier against Kubrat Pulev. So he's finding his optimum weight. I'm guessing Ruiz is looking to do the same thing. Have a few training camps to get that out of the way, to get the system worked out with his new coaches and new trainers. Then he will be ready to go at optimal weight and optimal boxing ability. That is what Andy Ruiz Jr. can do. Guys, anyway, what are your thoughts on this? Make sure you leave your thoughts in the comments below, leave a thumbs up, and subscribe if you are new. Thanks guys.